Good afternoon. I hope you've had a lovely lunch and you're ready for a crash course in international law. Yes? Okay, good. So the focus of my presentation is on the common home of humanity, but from a perspective of international law and governance. So this is our beautiful planet, and as you'll see, as I'm from New Zealand, I've made sure I chose an image of the Earth that shows New Zealand, because usually we're left off. But there we are, in the corner there. Now this image is really important because it tells us, it exemplifies what we've known for intuitively for a very long time, but now we know scientifically that the Earth is one giant, complex, interconnected Earth system. And in that sense, it's shared by all life and it supports all life. This is an Earth system that in a very fundamental way belongs to all of life. However, Earth system science is also really important for understanding the Earth, the planet that we live on, and the systems that sustain life. Earth system science is really important because it helps us understand the interplay of the complexities of physical relationships. But it also fundamentally helps us understand at a planetary scale, at a scale of interaction of large complex Earth systems, the impact of human activity on the Earth system. So we get an overview of what is really the impact now at a global scale of human activity. However, when we start to talk about law and governance, and when we start to talk about human responsibility for the Earth system, I think we also have to employ other language. And some very important language is contained in the Earth Charter. How many of you have heard of the Earth Charter? The Earth Charter was developed by global civil society as a way of articulating our responsibility for the planet, but also as a way of articulating our collective responsibility for each other. So it's a very good start point when we want to understand the language of law and governance and the language of collective responsibility. So this is a quote from the Earth Charter. We stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. As the world becomes increasingly interdependent and fragile, the future at once holds great peril and great promise. To move forward, we must recognize that in the midst of this magnificent diversity of cultures and life forms, we are one human family and one Earth community with a common destiny. And then it goes on and it says it invokes the language of responsibility. Towards this end, it is imperative that we, the peoples of the earth, declare our responsibility to one another, to the greater community of life, and to future generations. So the Earth Charter helps us to think of the Earth system as a giant commons, our common home, for which we have a collective responsibility to care for. So that sounds wonderful, but we have a very large problem, and that large problem comes from international law and governance. And from this perspective, we suffer from what is called in international law the territorial obsession of states, the territorial obsession of states, or the tragedy of fragmentation. Now, what happens in international law, as you probably all know, is that the planet becomes cut up and diced and split and fragmented, and so this Earth system is dismembered. And what we create is territories where states exercise exclusive rights to use use parts of the planet, to mistreat, abuse parts of the planet, to take from parts of the planet as they see fit, as they wish. And that includes the land in their jurisdiction, the air, the atmosphere, and increasingly our oceans. The outcome is that our giant commons in law becomes a fragmented patchwork of properties. And what's left over are a few remaining global commons. So the global commons becomes this idea of what's left over once states have taken pieces and exerted legal authority and jurisdiction over. And one of those important remaining global commons is the high seas. And the high seas becomes an important model for us when we're thinking about international law and governance. So the role of the law, when we have created this fragmented system, the role of international law is really to manage that system. It's a state-centered governance system, and it really focuses on the property within jurisdictions. It focuses on legal rights of use and abuse. So this leaves us with a very important question. Knowing what we know now about the Earth system, do we have a powerful legal, ethical and legal concept that we can use to govern ourselves in relation to our common home? Do we have a legal, ethical and legal concept out there which we can now use to transform the law, to make the law match what we know is our reality, our common home? So that is, can we transform the law to overcome the territorial obsession? Can we transform the law so that humanity can exercise at an international level collective responsibility for our impacts on the earth? Can we coordinate ourselves? Can we coordinate ourselves in terms of our activities within state territories and within the remaining global commons? Can we coordinate ourselves for the collective benefit rather than for the benefit of individual nation states? In other words, can we create at a global level a system of commons-based management? Can we do that? That is a fundamental question. In order to do that, do we have legal concepts that can help us get there? So that's my fundamental question. Do we have something that we can employ to transform the law? And I have a very optimistic answer, and it's yes. So I'm going to introduce you to the common heritage of mankind. So the common heritage of mankind is a legal concept that can be used as a model. We can use it creatively to transform at a higher level our understanding of our collective responsibility and the legal framework to achieve that. We can apply it at a planetary level. We can apply it to the Earth's system. It is an existing concept of international law, and that's really important. We're not creating something out of the box. This is not a rabbit we're pulling out of the box. It exists in international law, and it is considered as the best example, in fact, the only example of international trusteeship in the law. So I want to tell you now a little bit about the common heritage of mankind, just to elaborate a little bit on this concept, a little bit about its history, a very little bit about its content, something about the difficulties of using the common heritage, and then I'll finish by wrapping up looking again at its power and its potential. So the common heritage of mankind as a legal concept first emerged in international law in the 1960s in the context of the ocean, the need to create a new legal regime for the ocean. But its history is very, very old. It's just in the 60s it was the first time the common heritage concept was used in law. But to understand this legal concept, we have to look back into its its history. And its history I can summarize in this sense. In every legal culture, in every social culture, there's this idea that some things are so precious, are so essential that they belong to all. They cannot be owned by anyone. And that we have a moral obligation to look after those things that are the common heritage for the benefit of both present and future generations. So from this perspective, it was very easy for people to argue that the ocean, being the source and sustainer of all life on the planet, is a precious heritage. So this is a discussion that was occurring in the 50s and the 60s. Now, the reason that the common heritage popped up at that time in the context of the oceans was that people were very, very worried about the future of the oceans, even back in the 1960s. So there's nothing new. And the reasons they were so worried about the oceans was they could even see in the 50s and the 60s that the activity of states, and the activity primarily of states, was creating the threat of marine environmental degradation, but it was also creating social inequity. And that was going to lead to a major threat to international peace and security. So what they were identifying in the 60s was a race to grab and exploit the oceans that would make the rich richer and the poor poorer, and would degrade the ocean system. Now, I'm going to introduce you to the first of two very important people in the history of the common heritage of mankind. And this man is Arvid Pardo. He was a diplomat and an international lawyer. He's known as the father of the seas. He was a visionary. He was the person who stood up in the late 1960s before the United Nations, and he articulated the threats to the oceans as a whole integrated system. So he was a visionary, and he declared in a record-breaking 3-hour speech to the United Nations that the whole of the oceans should be the common heritage of mankind. He introduced this as a radical new idea in international law. And he said that we need a law and governance regime articulated through the common heritage to ensure that states don't claim as their territory any more of the oceans, to ensure that states don't, in exercising fishing rights, exploitation rights, that they don't further damage the marine environment, that it should be seen as an integrated ecological whole, that it should be governed, the oceans should be governed by all states together for the benefit of all humanity. Now, in making this assertion in the United Nations, he triggered what became the Law of the Sea Convention. So he triggered 10 years of negotiations that resulted in the Law of the Sea Convention. And as he developed that concept together with many other people, they had to flesh out what were the legal elements of this idea of the common heritage. So these are the key legal elements that they worked on. Non-appropriation, that is, you can't grab any more of what was left of the global commons. You cannot grab any more of the high seas. Hands off. When exercising rights to use the high seas or any part of the oceans, you really need to share the benefits. That the oceans should be for peaceful use. You should not be using the oceans to support your nuclear activities at that time. That ecological protection is critical to the common heritage and to the future of the oceans. And that states should be acting out of fairness and equity for the benefit of future generations and present generations. But what's really important about his concept for common heritage, as he spoke about it was a whole systems concept. It protected those parts of the ocean that remained unclaimed, that is the high seas. But then he had also a very important message for the United Nations. This idea of the common heritage should also apply to those parts of the oceans that states had already grabbed, had already claimed territory and jurisdiction over. So what he was saying was this common heritage concept imposes international legal obligations of responsibility and care for the benefit of everybody within the jurisdiction of nation states, not just on the high seas, but actually within the jurisdiction of nation states. And this restricted their sovereignty, and this transformed the role of states from being just there to serve their own needs and interests and those of their citizens to also having to exercise an obligation of responsibility. But the common heritage is much more than the sum of its legal parts, even though we lawyers like to dwell on all the legal elements. It's very much at the core of common heritage is human responsibility of care and respect for Earth, above the idea of use rights. States, according to the common heritage, must work for the benefit, the common good of all, and not exclusively in their national interests. And this obligation applies across space and territories, across time, and also employs concern about global inequity. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of nation states hated the idea of the common heritage. They really disliked it because it was going to limit what they could do in their own states, even in the global commons, and it was going to impose additional responsibilities on them. So very soon after the common heritage was introduced, states started to work in opposition to the common heritage. So what they started to do was try and limit its application. So instead of the common heritage applying to the whole of the oceans, from the coast to coast of every state, they negotiated through the Law of the Sea Convention that the common heritage concept would only apply to mineral mining on the deep sea bed. That is the only place that they would accept a common heritage regime. That is deep seabed mining, which is really not even started yet and was unlikely to ever start at the time. Institutional arrangements for the common heritage as it applies to the deep sea bed are very limited. Ocean grabbing still happens through very legally creative interpretations of the Law of the Sea Convention, and even ever since the Law of the Sea Convention, states have actively worked to block the common heritage of mankind principle. They've actively worked to block its further application beyond the deep sea bed. So it was, some people advocated it should be used in the Climate Change Convention for the global atmosphere, the Biodiversity Convention for global biodiversity. But every time we've tried to reapply the common heritage at a bigger scale, it has been blocked by states. They really dislike and reject the common heritage concept. Now, this left Arvid Pardo very disappointed and very despondent. His idea for common heritage had gone from a whole of oceans to just a mineral regime, a concept for mining minerals and dividing up the spoils of mineral mining. That's all it applied to. So he was very despondent. But gentlemen, there was a woman who was going to come to the rescue, and her name is Elizabeth Mann Borghese. She is known as the mother of the oceans, and she really introduces us to the power and scope of the common heritage. She refused to give up. She refused to be disappointed. She saw what happened in the Law of the Sea Convention, and she said, well, instead of it being a disappointment, she said at least the common heritage has a seed of application in international law. It's there and we can build upon it. So she was very adamant that we continue to understand the oceans as an interconnected whole, and that sooner or later states would understand that, and they would have to transform the law to act cooperatively in respect of the oceans. But here's her next step, and it's a really important step. She said the oceans are an interconnected whole. They are the common heritage of mankind, irrespective of whether states see that and accept it. And then she said, what applies to the oceans applies to the whole Earth system. It applies at a planetary scale. When we understand these ecological interconnections, there's no reason why the whole of the Earth system should not be the common heritage of mankind. So that was a huge vision that she had, and she exercised tremendous advocacy for that vision her whole life. But she was not a lawyer, and lawyers need non-lawyers to hold them to reality. And so she worked with Arvid Pardo, who at this point was a very depressed man. So she worked with him actively. And she said, Arvid, we need a big strategy. We need to think beyond nation states. And so what she advocated as part of this strategy was the creation of the UN Trusteeship Council. And she understood that if we could bring states together and put them in essentially a safe space and require that they operate as trustees, that they think of themselves as trustees for the whole of the Earth system, then they would learn an enormous amount from that, and they would start to understand how they can transform law and governance and the way they cooperate. Just to conclude then, common heritage has a very, very rich history as a concept of ethical and legal responsibility of states. Even though it only in a convention and a treaty applies to the deep sea bed, we have a seed of change. It is there. We don't have to create anything new, we just have to argue for its greater application. Reality check that we international lawyers always have is states hate any great idea, and they really don't like the common heritage, so it is an uphill battle. But we know it can be applied at the Earth system scale. There's no reason in law why it can't. The only reason we have trouble getting there is states are blocking that idea. So it can be applied to Earth as our common home. If we are to get there, if we are to transform law and governance in that way, though, we need to remember our visionary people, and that's why I introduced you to Arvid Pardo and Elizabeth Mamborghese. Remembering them, what their vision, what inspired them, remembering them and the history that they brought to this issue back in the 60s is important for us in going forward. They can guide us. But again, law has its limits, and we have to think how law operates as part of a much larger, bigger strategy. And just as Elizabeth saw a UN Trusteeship Council as being important, we have another level of critical importance, and that is if we as global citizens all start acting as if we are trustees of the planet, then we are in a position where we can require require that states start to act in that way as well. So the vision then is that through these efforts, states can no longer deny the existence of a moral responsibility to care for our common home for the benefit of all, and that this responsibility will be exercised for the whole of the Earth system. Thank you.